Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to this semester's Senior Thesis Symposium. It has been my very great pleasure to be mentoring this semester with our sole senior thesis student, who I will be introducing in a moment. Of course, Senior Thesis Symposium is an incredible opportunity for us to celebrate our graduating students and to see the culmination of all of their incredible hard work, not just over the course of this semester, but really over the course of the last 4 or 5 or 6 years that they have been working towards their degrees. So I want to, again, thank you for coming and helping us to celebrate this incredible achievement. I will, of course, be introducing our senior thesis student in a moment, and then our talk will be followed by a question and answer session. And we invite those of you who are joining us online to please feel free to participate. I'll be reading any questions that are put into the chat. And then, of course, we'll be completing our celebration with some light refreshments and conversation. So we hope that you'll all stick around and join us for that as well. Again, it's now my great pleasure to introduce our senior thesis student for this semester, Kendall Taylor. Kendall has been working on this thesis project even since before this semester. She was working over the summer and a bit at the end of last semester. Kendall, of course, has been around our department for a number of years and has worked on campus in a number of capacities. She also was a member of the pioneering first group of MSU docents to work in a pilot program at the Denver Art Museum. So she was a trailblazer in that program, helping us to kind of work out the kinks and to learn about how this program could really serve as a powerful channel for our students to learn more about museums. And following that, of course, she now has a position working at the Denver Art Museum as the Talent and Culture Coordinator. And we're incredibly proud of her achievements. This project, looking at the medieval stonework of the capital of Great Zimbabwe, is just a facet of Kendall's research and interest in medieval African art, something that she hopes to continue to study in graduate school after her graduation. Of course, in addition to my role in the class, I also want to draw our attention to Professor Summer Trenton over here, who also served as outside advisor on this project. And thank you to Dr. Trenton for her mentorship as well. And now if you'll all help me to welcome Kendall Taylor for her presentation, The Cattle and the Crocodile, Animal Motifs of the Great Zimbabwe Complex.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Mollenhauer, and for your guidance throughout this process. A big thank you to Dr. Trenton as well. I appreciate your help. And a big thank you to everyone in attendance. This session is recorded. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation. For those online, as Dr. Mollenhauer mentioned, you can use the chat function for questions. And I present to you The Cattle and Crocodile, Animal Motifs at the Great Zimbabwe Complex. I will present my thesis in 3 parts, focusing on aspects of the Southern medieval African mortarless stone architecture by explaining Part 1, the Great Zimbabwe Complex. Part 2, I will discuss the inhabitants, the Shona Karanga community, and I will share some details about their social structures. In part 3, I will discuss how the animal motif of cattle and crocodile are utilized to denote sacred spaces at the Great Zimbabwe Complex. Let's begin with part 1, the complex. Fantastic. On this map, I have highlighted an area. Couldn't find the pointer, sorry. Oh, that's right. Oh. Thank you. On this map, I have highlighted the area in Africa, which I will focus. This is a timeline of the medieval period of the established kingdoms before and after the Great Zimbabwe Complex. The medieval Karanga capital is housed at the Great Zimbabwe Complex, during the Great Zimbabwe Kingdom, which is 1300 to 1450 CE. I will discuss the granite architectural practice of the region, specifically at the complex. This monumental city compound was established by the Karenga people, a subgroup of Shona. They, like neighboring subgroups of Shona, were skilled in the art of granite architecture, with an animal motif aesthetic that was guided by images connected to their spirituality. The animal motifs were expressed in naturalistic and simplified geometric forms, composed of precisely layered granite bricks. The animal motif served as a stone message that explained how specific community members use sacred spaces. The design of the stonework explained the structure's purpose and denoted how duty was fulfilled to ancestor, deity, and community. The animal motifs at the Great Zimbabwe Complex will be exemplified in the two examples, cattle and crocodile, expressed through that mortarless masonry. The cattle will assist in the understanding of the foundation's circular pattern. The crocodile will explain the importance of why each mortarless stone is stacked atop one another in a particular composition. A sacred space of the Shona Karenga people is the royal court, which was a circular space under a shaded tree under which the chief would hold court, as we see in this image. In this era of the court, located at the nearby site called K2, and this is going to be from the period 1000 to 1220 CE, near the Mampungwe Hill, and is the architectural ancestor to the Great Zimbabwe Complex. This design would later transform into the Central Cattle Pattern, or CCP. As we see in this image, now the court is included, or has included, defensive walls of stone and wood that enclose the court. In this image on the right, we see how the route of circumambulation of the space begins down here with the front public secular entrance, which correlates with this map, denoting that that's where the followers would have entered. The CCP encompassed more land to accommodate royal cattle, court, and created more defined gender-specific spaces. The transition of the Shona Karenga capital to the Great Zimbabwe Plateau was aided by increased land and wealth expansion. The CCP transitioned into the Zimbabwe pattern, which we see at the Great Zimbabwe Complex. This is the Zimbabwe pattern. The pattern was used for privatized sacred spaces to further divide gender-specific access and divide elites from non-elites. In comparison to the CCP, we see that we have an addition of guards and the removal of a center inner circle, which made the space more exclusive. And now with guards surrounding the structure to enforce the privatized access. At an elevation of 4,000 to 5,000 feet, the Zimbabwe Plateau is home to the Great Zimbabwe Complex. At the higher elevation, as I've noted with the red circle, is the summit area and hill complex, which was exclusive to royalty. Next, I've highlighted the upper and lower valley enclosures. This encompassed smaller enclosures fitted for wives, children, extended family members as well. And lastly, the great enclosure on the outskirts of the valley enclosures have curved wall of organized granite for ritual and educational purposes. Part 2, we discuss the community. This thesis is aided by multiple introductions to societal constructs that are required that require a layered explanation to fully realize the importance of the stonework at the Great Zimbabwe Complex. To understand the aesthetic features, one must understand the importance of cattle as currency, which is needed to expand the empire. This explains the similarities of cattle corrals and the city layouts. One must also understand aspects of monotheism and ancestor worship to the Karenga. The intertwined and reoccurring themes of ancestor messages, sacred kingship, and community duties are reiterated and reverberate through the visual aesthetic. The spiritual hierarchy is composed of Maori, or God, ancestors, spiritual beings, humans, and then objects and substances. The royal and elite classes were in their role due to lineage or marriage connection. The sacred leaders and chief were bestowed with responsibility to perform political and piety duties to ensure crops, cattle, and children thrive. This responsibility required them to appease the masses in spiritual and human realms. The primary deity, Maori, centered animal totems, like the crocodile, as a messenger and vessel for divine guidance. The elites were defined by individual wealth and cattle, whereas the wealth of the royal class was defined not only by their individual cattle wealth, but in the practice that consolidated and increased the power through the ownership of all cattle of the empire. The cattle symbolism served as an inspiration for permanent structures as the empire grew and stabilized. Let's talk about the Zimbabwe pattern at the Great Zimbabwe Complex a little bit more. This prioritizes the division of sacred space and again utilizes the security for both the living currency of cattle and the collective protection of societal elites. Devoid of corners, the back of the rounded structure relative to the entrance here at the front is reserved for royals and elite members, whereas the public had access to the front with trusted court members in the middle. Rituals were used in designated spaces to interpret spiritual messages intended to maintain balance in the material and spiritual realms, and to implement political authority through bureaucracy. Part 3, Cattle and Crocodile. This will serve as an introduction to the mortarless stonemasonry. The stonework at the Great Zimbabwe Complex informed the viewer how to navigate the circular enclosures. The architects, stonemasons, and quarriers would determine which granite pieces would be best for different construction needs from public to private. The stone walls were explained through 4 types of masonry that range from rough to more precise and uniform stone, presented as P, PQ, Q, and R styles. This is an image that again shows the map of the complex as seen before in slides, correlating to different types of stonework, which we will better understand here in the next couple of slides. Symmetrical stones would be used for Q style masonry, which was associated with royal and sacred spaces. Undefined and irregular stones would be used for less precise R style in comparison to the Q and was used for public spaces. The P style type of masonry was used for boundary or defense walls because of the lower labor costs associated with this construction. The PQ style used regular and irregular stones. This is a dry stack organization pattern with qualities of both P and Q. And here is an example of the P and Q. This is a wall at the Great Enclosure And I'll get a little closer here to point out exactly that difference. But what we're looking at is the P and Q with the more organized style and the irregular style. So I'm gonna get a little closer. I'm gonna mute you. And irregular. Wonderful. Now let's bring it all together. And this is where we get the messages in the stonework. So at the great enclosure, the stonework pattern denoted a crocodile motif, which is used to designate gendered spaces where elite members would hold rituals like fertility for women or livestock, or use in rituals that would usher in the transition into puberty. And this is noted with the chevron pattern, which is up here. The Shona Karenga used different geometric crocodile motif designs to denote their age and gender in relation to the purpose of the building. The structure's outer walls were created with granite bricks placed at different angles to complete the message to the viewer. Shona myth dictates that kings become crocodiles, acting as a channel for communication from ancestors and deities. See graphic here, and that chevron pattern. In conclusion, the Great Zimbabwe Complex's granite stonework was utilized to denote sacred spaces. The complex masterfully combines functionality and ornamentation for the communication of community roles and responsibilities through the animal motifs. The analysis of the Great Zimbabwe Complex would not be complete without proper acknowledgement of the overlapping use of animal motifs to communicate how they interact with the sacred space. All of the aspects that I've discussed are needed to fully understand the narrative and purpose of the Great Zimbabwe Complex as an example of Southern African medieval stone architecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kendall. We will now have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. And so I'll invite Kendall to come back up to answer your questions, and I'll read out any questions from the chat online.
Before we officially begin, I'm going to have a sip of water. Folks, I'm ready for you. Summer, Dr. Hinton, yes.
A question about, and I'm sorry if you explained this and I missed it, but the pattern, the chevron pattern, is that supposed, is the interpretation that it represents the teeth of the crocodile?
That is a wonderful question. And the way I understand it is that we're abstracting scales and negative, positive space in that design. And then from there, there would be interpretation, but I do like the teeth. Yes.
And is it only in the, it's only in the back where the king?
Correct. You're going to see designs like that only in sacred spaces. You can consider it the less organized the stonework for more public spaces, the more organized for the more sacred spaces.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. Please, thank you.
Have you been?
I have not, but it's on my to-do list. It's definitely something that's going to be imperative to my work to go do site research. There's also an aspect of some of the materials that would have been very helpful to my research. They are from Zimbabwean scholars that their materials have not quite made it over to Western libraries, so to speak. And so going there will also be extremely beneficial to access Zimbabwean resources. Thank you. Yes.
We're very curious about these spaces. Did they have to be excavated? How are they in such pristine condition? When did the populations move? How are they still in such great shape?
That is a great question. And I think it's really fascinating because grade shape is relative to what? Because it is mortarless stone masonry, that in itself has a protective quality. But there also has to be noted that during the scramble of Africa in the 1800s, when the colonizers moved in, they did attempt to beautify, so to speak, the complex, which means they actually removed a lot of very valuable detail. And so organization, cleanliness associated with what? Now it's a UNESCO site. And so we have different aspects of preservation that are going on to help keep it pristine. As far as when they found the complex, so to speak, due to natural occurring drought, weather, how crops are doing in conjunction with infighting, is going to see a shift in that capital. And so some scholars might say it had been abandoned, but really those people just moved to a new location. Yes.
We've got several online
Oh my
questions.
goodness. Yes, we
So
do. Okay. Thank you
let
so
me pull up the first one
Wonderful.
from Caroline, who is asking, what made you decide on this particular focus and how has it changed your worldview with all that you have learned?
Thank you so much for the question. I chose this topic in my studies within African studies as my minor. And we first began talking about the Swahili coast, and then I learned about the Zimbabwe complex. But then because of class availability and other aspects, I never really got a chance to revisit this topic. Therefore, it has always stayed a personal passion project of mine. And so getting into it more and more, for me, it's really just strengthened the need for decolonization within art history. And it's strengthened a need to understand what post-colonized world of art history and understanding structures like this. And what that can actually translate into is the time period would place it as if it should be a part of the gunpowder empires. But we need to have more proper focused scholarship to see that that's about a viable option. The same way within a medieval narrative and timeline, what is being incorporated from the Southern African region and what is being ignored, trade routes. And so it really opened up the opportunity to do a lot of different research within this one area. Thank you so much.
Question from Shannon. A question about gendered spaces in the complex. You mentioned variations in space across class and position, but I wondered how these motifs, which you said changed based on a gendered context, changed based on public versus private areas.
Yes. And so what that's going to look like is within sacred spaces, you're going to see that gender is going to place them as wives. So there's going to be ideas of gender, but we really want to kind of move away from Western concepts. So unfortunately, it's a little bit of a can of worms. But once we get into public spaces, you start seeing the community aspect where something like puberty rights, the great enclosure would have been used for that initiation. So both male and female in this society would have used the space without, what's what I'm looking for? Unlike the sacred spaces, they can move about that public space differently, where sacred spaces is a bit more designated. Hopefully that made a little sense.
I'm going to prioritize the online questions because the Zoom is going to shut down. So,
yes, yeah.
So, question from Professor Weiss joining us online. Were these designs found in other mediums?
Yes, thank you so much for asking this. So the abstracted scales, going back to Dr. Trenton's question, thinking about the chevron style. So the scales will show up maybe naturalistic on a mancala board. It'll show up as a literal figurine. And so it's really the reuse of the image of the crocodile, and it can be done in naturalistic, simplified, or abstracted ways. And so it is going to be a reused theme that we're going to see in different types of art, handheld, different functions, and different artwork as well. So yes, thank you so much.
Emile, sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing your name, asks a question. Is there any evidence that the animals themselves were present in these spaces?
That is an interesting question. Trying to think what that might, how literal that might mean.
Were there cattle in these spaces? Were there crocodiles? in these spaces?
Thank you, okay. So with cattle, yes. What started as that circular cattle corral, going to be centralized for protection. So earlier iterations of this type of design would see the cattle, which would be very important to protect, surrounded by humans. And so as the space evolved, the cattle still remained close, because that was living currency. Something like the crocodile becomes metaphoric. So there's a proverb that is something to the effect of the crocodile stays in its pond. So the circular enclosure now becomes a pond, and the evocation of that deity and its use in the space, the energy, so to speak, would be that crocodile in a metaphoric way within the space. So a yes and no.
All right, I don't see any other questions online. Feel free to add into the chat, but we now have the option to take some more questions.
Hello, yes. If you don't mind, I'm gonna grab Linda here, yes.
So as an artist, and by the way, I want my bird back.
Yes, I know, I'm so sorry.
As an artist, how do you see this moving forward in your studies, in your career, in an artistic form?
In an artistic form, I love that